Black America. John Lewis here again with Xknown, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 3 of Xcast, Voices of the Unforgotten. And today we'll be talking about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So let's go ahead and hop right on into it. Now, Frances Harper was born in 1825 in Baltimore, Maryland, a slave state. And she was born free. That word sounds powerful. It sounds like safety. It sounds like opportunity. But in the America Frances entered, free didn't mean protected. It didn't mean equal. It didn't mean secure. It simply meant this. She was not owned on paper, but she was still surrounded by chains. Before Frances could remember being held by her parents, both of them died. By the age of 3, she was already an orphan. No soft landing, no childhood shield, no guarantee of care. She was taken in by her uncle, Reverend William Watkins, a radical abolitionist, educator, and minister who believed something dangerous for the time. That the greatest threat to slavery was not rebellion, but education. His school in Baltimore was one of the few places where black children were taught to read, write, think critically, and speak publicly. Frances didn't grow up memorizing obedience. She grew up memorizing language, scripture, history, and argument. She learned early that words could move people and that truth could frighten power. But even with education, Frances lived under constant threat. Free black children in slave states were kidnapped and sold south every year. Slave catchers moved through Baltimore like hunters through open land. There were no police for black protection, no courts that offered real justice. Freedom for a black child meant you could be stolen at any moment. So Frances learned vigilance before she learned comfort. She learned how to measure danger in silence. She learned how to read rooms, how to listen for footsteps that didn't belong. Fear was not weakness, it was survival training. As a teenager, Frances discovered poetry. But for her, words were never decoration. They were tools. She wrote about enslaved mamas watching their children sold away. She wrote about Christian hypocrisy. She wrote about loneliness, grief, faith, and rage. Her poems didn't beg, they confronted. And in 1845, at just 21 years old, Frances published her first book of poetry, Forest Leaves. Let that sit in for a moment. A young black woman publishing literature in a slave-holding nation. She didn't wait for permission. She printed her existence into the historical record. Then America passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, one of the most violent laws in its history. It made it legal to kidnap black people in free states. It forced citizens to assist in slave capture. It punished anyone who helped someone escape. Overnight, the difference between free and enslaved collapsed. Frances watched fear spread through black communities. Families fled north. Churches emptied. Homes became traps. And Frances made a decision that would define her life. She would not be quiet. She stepped into the abolitionist lecture circuit, one of the most dangerous public spaces in America at the time. She stood on stages where black women were not welcome, not protected, and not expected to speak. She addressed crowds filled with people deciding in real time whether she was human. And she spoke anyway. She spoke about enslaved mamas, about sexual violence, about religious lies, about a nation praying loudly while brutalizing quietly. Her question followed her everywhere. How can you claim to love God while you sell his children? In 1854, she published poems on miscellaneous subjects. It sold over 10,000 copies. That was unheard of for a black woman in the 19th century. Her words traveled where she could not, her ideas entered homes that would never invite her inside. Her voice slipped into rooms that would never seat her at the table. She had become dangerous in the most powerful way possible. She was being heard. When the Civil War finally erupted, America told itself a story. It said the war was about preserving the Union. Later, it would say it was about freedom. Later still, it would call itself redeemed. But for the people Frances Harper walked among after emancipation, the story felt very different. Freedom arrived, but so did hunger. So did homelessness. So did disease. So did unpunished white violence. And so did political abandonment. Frances did not stay in safe lecture halls discussing theory. She went into the aftermath. She traveled through freedmen's camps and church basements packed with families who had nowhere else to go. She walked through abandoned plantations now filled with refugees. She saw towns burned by retreating armies. She saw black families free in name, but exposed in reality. And she understood something immediately. Emancipation without preparation was only half of freedom. So Frances became a teacher of the newly freed, not in comfort, but in crisis. She taught adults who had never been allowed to hold books, children whose parents had been sold away, entire families who did not know their legal rights, their options, or their protections. For Frances, literacy was not polite education. It was armor. If you could read a contract, you couldn't be cheated as easily. If you could read a law, you could challenge it. If you could read scripture for yourself, no one could weaponize God against you without resistance. She later wrote that ignorance was one of slavery's most effective tools, even after slavery itself had been declared illegal. Reconstruction, on paper, promised everything. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th promised equal protection. The 15th granted black men the right to vote. But Frances watched the truth unfold beneath the ink. Former Confederates regained political power. Black voters were terrorized at the polls. White militias formed openly. Courts refused to prosecute racial violence. Freedom was being offered with one hand, while on the other, quietly rebuilt the cage. At the same time, the women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum. White women demanded voting rights, public recognition, political power. Frances supported women's rights, but she refused to support a version of feminism that excluded black people. In 1866, she stood at a National Women's Rights Convention and delivered one of the most important intersectional speeches in American history. She told the room, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity." And then she said what many in that room did not want to hear. Black women were being raped without legal protection, beaten without recourse, disenfranchised without apology, and erased from movements that claimed to speak for all women. Her message was unmistakable. If your feminism requires my silence, then your feminism is broken. That moment placed Frances in a dangerous position. She challenged racists. She challenged sexists. She challenged white suffragists who wanted power before justice. And she challenged black leaders who wanted racial progress without gender equality. She did not belong neatly to one movement. And history often punishes people who refuse to simplify themselves. But Frances would not choose fragments of justice. She demanded it whole. When speeches were no longer enough, she turned to fiction. In 1892, Frances published her novel, Lola Leroy. This wasn't entertainment. It was excavation. Through fiction, she exposed racial passing, sexual violence inside slavery, Christian hypocrisy, and the psychological aftermath of being owned. She gave voice to characters history preferred to flatten or erase. She wasn't just recording black life. She was reshaping how Black life could be narrated. As white women's organizations continued to silence Black women, Frances helped build something different. She became a national leader in the creation of the National Association of Colored Women. Its motto, "Lifting as we climb," which meant progress was never individual. Every rise carried responsibility. Every victory created obligation. Under that banner, Black women organized schools, anti-lynching campaigns, political training, economic cooperatives, and community defense. Frances was no longer just a speaker. She was a nation builder. As the 1800s came to a close, America hardened. Reconstruction collapsed. Jim Crow rose. Lynching spread like an unspoken law. Black political power was stripped back through violence, policy, and silence. And through it all, Frances did not retreat. She aged into resistance. In her later years, Frances became an elder of the movement, not in title, but in burden. She had lived long enough to see slavery abolished, Reconstruction rise, and nearly every gain stolen back again. She watched Black men lose voting rights they had only just gained. She watched segregated schools become permanent. She watched white terrorism go largely unpunished. She watched the nation congratulate itself while abandoning Black lives. And she kept speaking, not with youth, with clarity. She once said, "The moral character of a nation is determined by the justice it shows to the weak." And by that standard, America was still failing. Unlike many public figures, Frances never chose comfort over truth. She never retreated into private wealth, never softened her message for applause, never withdrew her criticism for excess. Her life was not about respectability. It was about responsibility. She believed that to know truth and not to speak it was a form of betrayal. So she kept telling the truth, even when fewer people wanted to hear it. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper died in 1911. There was no national tributes, no major monuments, no school systems renamed in her honor. Within a generation, her name slipped quietly out of classrooms. Her poems faded from curriculum. Her speeches were shelved. Her political leadership minimized. History did something it often does to Black women who refuse to be manageable. It made her invisible. This erasure was not accidental. Frances was difficult to package. She spoke against racism, sexism, economic injustice, religious hypocrisy, political cowardice, and violence, all at the same time. She did not belong neatly to one movement. She demanded that every system be confronted together. And that made her too radical for polite abolitionists, too Black for white feminists, too female for male political leaders. So the easiest solution for history was silence. But even without statues, Frances left behind what could not be erased. She left one of the earliest traditions of Black women's political writing. She left a blueprint for intersectional justice before the term existed. She laid the spiritual foundation for leaders like Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer. She helped shape the organizing philosophy of lifting as we climb. She taught that rising alone is not victory. Only collective ascent is. Frances matters today because she proves something uncomfortable. You can be brilliant without being protected. You can be correct without being celebrated. You can tell the truth without being rewarded. And you can change systems without being honored by them. Her life reminds us that visibility is not guaranteed by impact. It is guaranteed by those who control memory. And that's why stories like hers must be spoken out loud, again and again. Because when truth tellers are erased, injustice feels inevitable. But when we remember them, we inherit their courage. You see, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, she matters to me because she refused fragments. She refused to pick one injustice and ignore the rest. She refused to be quiet so others could be comfortable. She teaches us that progress has always been inconvenient, that truth has always been called too loud, too angry, too direct, too much. And yet, every freedom we claim today was built by people like her. So go to Xknown.com right now. Read that mission statement. Look through the Share the Knowledge page. Copy and repost that link because it's on us to share it, because they won't. I'll say it again. Go to Xknown.com right now. Read through the mission statement. Look through the Share the Knowledge page. Then copy and repost that link because it's on us to share it, because they won't. And then wear the legacy. Let people ask you what that crest means, and tell them about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Tell them how she spoke when silence was safer. Tell them how she forced a nation to listen when it would rather forget. Tell them why she matters. Tell them we will not forget. This is Xknown, for the people they tried to erase but couldn't.